Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be diving into a pretty tricky situation, one that really makes you think about parental rights and responsibilities. Okay, so imagine this. You're in a short-term relationship, things end, and all of a sudden you find out you're going to be a parent, but you never wanted kids, especially not in a situation like this. Can you legally just walk away?
Well, it's a question we see come up a lot, and honestly, the answer is way more complicated than a simple yes or no. We've got some sources here that take a deep dive into this exact scenario, and, well, it turns out there's a lot to unpack here.
Okay, so let's get into it. Our listener is asking about a situation where a man was in a 6-month relationship, things ended, and now there's a baby on the way. He was clear from the beginning that he did not want to be a father, but the woman decided to have the child anyway. Now he's wondering what his options are.
Right, and this is where the difference between parental rights and parental responsibilities gets really interesting. See, the law oftentimes treats those two things totally separately. Terminating your legal rights as a parent doesn't automatically wipe away your responsibilities, especially when it comes to financially supporting the child.
Wait, so you're saying even if he doesn't want to be a dad, the courts could still say he's on the hook financially? That seems kind of counterintuitive.
It does, but the courts are always going to prioritize what's best for the child. And that usually includes financial support from both parents, regardless of their relationship status. In fact, there was a landmark case back in 1973, Gomez v. Perez, where the Supreme Court ruled that children born out of wedlock have the same right to financial support from their fathers as children born within a marriage. That really set a precedent for how these cases are viewed legally.
So it's not like those movie scenes where someone just signs a paper and walks away scot-free?
Not quite. Child support isn't viewed as something that you owe to the other parent. It's a duty to the child. So even if a father wants nothing to do with the child, he might still be legally required to provide financial support. And actually waiving that responsibility is extremely rare. It usually only happens if the mother is independently wealthy and agrees to completely forego child support.
Wow, okay, so what happens if our listener is thinking, this isn't fair, I never wanted this child, but now I'm stuck paying for them? It does seem like he's kind of in a tough spot, even if legally it makes sense.
Oh, you can absolutely see his point. It's definitely a situation that sparks a lot of debate.
Hmm.
But to answer your question, the source material we have here points out that unless the mother agrees to waive child support, the most likely outcome is a court-ordered child support arrangement. And the courts take that responsibility seriously. I mean, we are talking about the well-being of a child, after all.
That makes sense, but what exactly does best interest of the child mean? I mean, is it just about money?
Well, it's definitely a big part of it, but it goes beyond just finances. The courts look at a whole range of factors when determining what's best for the child.
Hmm.
Things like stability, emotional well-being, access to education, healthcare, all of those things come into play. And they'll consider the father's involvement, too, even if he's not seeking custody.
So it's not just a black and white situation. There's a lot of nuance involved.
Absolutely. And that's why these cases can be so complex and emotionally charged.
Well, we've covered the financial side of things pretty thoroughly, but we know this isn't just about dollars and cents. There's a whole human element to this situation, and I imagine there are some potential emotional landmines here, right?
You're absolutely right, and that's actually what we're going to explore next. Terminating parental rights can have a huge impact on a child, and not always in a positive way.
This is definitely heavy stuff, but before we get into that, let's take a quick moment to address our listener directly. If you're finding yourself in a similar situation, remember, knowledge is power. We're here to help you understand the complexities, but it is important to seek legal counsel early on to get personalized advice.
Couldn't agree more. Understanding your options is crucial.
Okay, so now let's dive into the emotional side of things. What kind of impact are we talking about here? So we've talked about the legal and financial side of things, but now let's get into the emotional impact of a situation like this. I mean, it's got to be tough on everyone involved.
It really is. And, it's something that really struck me while I was reading through these sources was the psychological aspect for the child.
Oh, yeah.
Like growing up knowing that one parent didn't want them or chose not to be involved can really create some challenges.
Yeah, it makes you wonder about those long-term effects. Like, does this create a sense of abandonment that carries into adulthood?
Absolutely. The sources actually cite studies that show a correlation between parental rejection and a higher risk of mental health issues later in life, things like depression and anxiety.
Wow.
There's also a tendency for these children to struggle with forming healthy attachments in their own relationships.
It's heartbreaking to think about a child growing up feeling unwanted, like a fundamental need isn't being met.
Exactly. And, this whole situation It really highlights a kind of imbalance in the decision-making process when it comes to having children.
Yeah.
One person ultimately makes the choice to continue a pregnancy, but then the legal system imposes obligations on both parties.
So, in a way, the father is being held accountable for a decision he didn't fully control.
That's a valid point, and
Yeah.
it brings up some interesting questions about personal autonomy versus societal expectations.
It's almost like a clash of values. On one hand, you have the father's right to choose whether or not he wants to be a parent, and on the other hand, you have the child's right to financial and emotional support.
And the courts are tasked with figuring out how to balance those competing interests, which is no easy feat. But one thing the sources all seem to agree on is that communication is key.
You mean communication between the parents?
Exactly. Having those open and honest conversations about expectations and potential outcomes before a pregnancy even occurs is crucial. I know it can be a difficult conversation to have, but it could prevent a lot of heartache down the line.
It's like that saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. It's so much better to address these issues head on rather than trying to untangle them after the fact.
Couldn't agree more. And, even in situations where an unplanned pregnancy happens, clear communication between the parents can make a huge difference in how things play out. It can help everyone involved feel more understood and respected, even if they don't agree on everything.
That makes sense. So what about our listener who's in the thick of this situation right now? What can he do to navigate these emotional complexities?
Well, first and foremost, I'd encourage him to seek out some support for himself. This is a difficult situation to process emotionally, and having a therapist or counselor to talk to can be incredibly helpful.
Yeah, it's like that oxygen mask analogy they give you on airplanes. You take care of yourself first before you can help others.
Exactly. And once he's feeling more grounded, he can start thinking about how he wants to approach his role in the child's life. Even if he doesn't want to be a traditional dad, there are still ways he can contribute to the child's well-being.
So you're saying even if he terminates his parental rights, he can still choose to be involved in some way?
That's definitely a possibility depending on the circumstances and what everyone involved agrees to.
Yeah.
It might look different from a typical father-child relationship, but it could still provide some level of support and connection for the child.
That's a good point. It's not always an all or nothing situation.
Right. And I think it's important to remember that every situation is unique. There's no one-size-fits-all solution when it comes to something as complex as family dynamics.
Yeah, I think we've really highlighted that throughout this deep dive, it's not about making judgments or offering those easy answers. It's about exploring the nuances and understanding the different perspectives involved.
Absolutely. And I think that's what makes this topic so fascinating and important to discuss.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to shift gears and talk about some potential outcomes based on the information we have. What are some of the possibilities our listener might be facing?
Okay, so we've explored the legal side, the financial implications, and the emotional roller coaster that comes with a situation like this. But let's get down to brass tacks here. What are some of the potential outcomes our listener might be facing?
Well, based on the sources we have, there are a few different paths
Yeah.
this could take. One possibility is that the father's parental rights are terminated. But as we discussed, that's pretty rare without the mother's consent or some pretty compelling reasons. It's not as simple as just saying, I don't want to be a father, and having the courts automatically sign off on it.
So not exactly a get-out-of-jail-free card then, not even close.
Yeah.
Then there's the possibility of waiving financial responsibility. But as we've already talked about, that's kind of a long shot. The courts almost always prioritize the child's financial well-being. And unless the mother is in a very unique financial situation and agrees to forego child support, it's pretty unlikely a judge would just approve that.
Right, so that's probably off the table too. What about the other options?
Well, the most likely scenario, statistically speaking, is that the court orders child support. That means the father will be financially responsible for the child even if he doesn't have a relationship with them. And this is where things can get really complicated emotionally.
Especially if he's feeling resentful or like he doesn't have a choice in the matter. It's a lot to process.
It really is. And there's one more outcome we need to mention. Even though it's less common, the father could actually lose any legal access to the child, even if his parental rights are terminated.
Hold on, how is that possible?
Yeah.
You're saying he could end up with zero rights but still have all the responsibilities.
It's not the typical outcome, but it can happen if the court decides that any contact with the father would harm the child's well-being. They might sever all legal ties, even the financial ones.
Wow, that's a lot to take in this whole situation. Is like a tangled web. It's clear there are no easy answers.
You got that right, and I think that's the biggest takeaway from all of this. It's so important to understand the complexities of these situations, both legally and emotionally.
And what about the father in our listener's question? What advice would you give him knowing what we know now?
First and foremost, I'd say get legal counsel. It's essential to have an expert in your corner who can explain your options and advocate for your best interests. But beyond that, I'd encourage him to really think about the long game here. This isn't just about the next few months or even years.
Hmm.
This is about a child's life, and the decisions made now will have, repercussions for decades to come.
So it's about balancing his own needs and feelings with the needs of the child.
Exactly, and it's about understanding that even though he didn't choose to become a father, he now has a role to play in shaping a young life.
Hmm.
It's a heavy responsibility, but it's one that shouldn't be taken lightly.
It's about stepping up, even if it's not the path he envisioned for himself.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And, at the end of the day, this situation really underscores the importance of having those tough conversations about family planning. Before pregnancy is even on the table. It might
Yeah.
not be the most romantic dinner conversation, but it could save a lot of heartache and uncertainty down the line.
It's about being proactive and making informed decisions together.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power, and open communication is key.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. This deep dive has been eye-opening, to say the least.
I agree. It's a reminder that life is full of surprises, and sometimes those surprises come with some pretty complex legal and emotional baggage.
But even in the midst of all that complexity, there's always hope, and there's always a way to move forward with empathy and understanding.
Beautifully said.
So, to our listener who submitted this question, we hope this deep dive has provided some clarity and maybe even a bit of comfort knowing you're not alone in this. And to everyone else listening, remember that knowledge is power.
Keep asking those tough questions and having those honest conversations.
And most importantly, keep diving deep. This is The Deep Dive signing off until next time.